A palimpsest is a piece of writing material on which later writing has been superimposed while traces of the original remains. It represents a failed attempt to erase, efface, or silence. It functions as an interlocutory tool, bringing the past into conversations with the present, where omissions may ghost the reader as words and the reference come out of hiding in ways that deny closure. Though often used to denote literary or historical artifacts, a palimpsest can be conceptualized in geographical terms. The land beneath our feet bears physical, cultural, and historical dimensions that are concealed from the cursory pedestrian. Overall, these layers of information can enlighten and inform our sense of place. Cherie Dimaline's novel, The Marrow Thieves, is a post-apocalyptic work of young adult fiction set across a Canadian landscape marred by resource extraction and environmental damage. Every non-Indigenous person has been afflicted with a disturbing disease. They have altogether forgotten how to dream, and this has resulted in a case of widespread madness. Indigenous people are being hunted for their bone marrow, as the non-consensual extraction and consumption of this ingredient is believed to provide an antidote for those undreaming and ill. In this novel, a group of Indigenous characters from various nations have banded together to avoid being imprisoned in residential schools that have been erected across Ontario. Through their constant pursuit and struggle to survive, they manage to uncover and recover a vital sense of sovereignty within the context they find themselves. In my paper, I argue that the remembrance and regeneration of language tools steadily enables Dimaline's characters to impose their own spaces of freedom upon the land, spaces where the past informs the present while also projecting towards a future. I suggest that the setting in The Marrow Thieves functions as a dynamic terrestrial palimpsest, where Dimaline's main characters relocate as they re-relate to the land, learning from it while not forgetting or obviating the past harms inflicted upon it. I further examine how language recovery, stories, writing, poetry, and song are all presented as personal, communal, and interstitial evocations of freedom, freedoms that resurge from within the layered terrain on which Dimaline's characters tread. As a graduate student and teacher of Greek descent, I acknowledge that my analysis that follows is informed by my distinct experiences. In other words, I read through a lens of which I strive to be mindful and self-reflective as I add my own connections and interpretations. My analysis is additionally complicated by the limitations of the English language and the complexities of cultural translation. As a reader, my interpretations will be partial and indefinite. In my research for this paper, I found myself reading about Anishinaabe cosmology and words. I engaged with various scholars featured in the collection centering Anishinaabe studies in an attempt to create a more composite analysis of themes within The Marrow Thieves. The way I understood these readings helped me understand the significance of story in relation to Indigenous epistemologies and worldviews. As I engaged with Dimaline's work, it became my impression that Mississauga Anishinaabe writer Leanne Simpson's short narrative for Asinykwe may be construed as a conceptual soulmate to Dimaline's novel. Simpson is an author, artist, and activist whose works often break open intersections between politics, story, and song, with texts and audio that are characteristically rich and layered, and often centered around the idea that narrative arts can function as an empowering means of asserting one's sovereignty. For Asinykwe is a short work of poetic prose featured in the book Islands of Decolonial Love. It is set during a time of devastation and drastic alteration in a world that was thrown, a world where the planetary mother was shaken so hard that everything cracked, shattered. The speaker's words reflect on a space and moment in time where no one knew what to do, where some people didn't survive, and where some people worked hard at just breathing. Simpson describes a sense of stasis that had overcome a group of people waiting in incertitude, a people who, after the destruction of their world, either aimed to cope or, as the speaker brusquely suggests, endeavored to forget, suppress, and move on. Here, Simpson's prose, though short and compact, holds together many thematic layers. Within this context of reflective stasis, Simpson identifies one holy woman, an Ogichidakwe wise woman healer, who willfully wanders in search of scattered, dispersed fragments of Anishinaabe language. Traversing the land, she communicates with elders and memory keepers to record stories, ceremonies, songs, and dances. Gradually, she cultivates a beautiful floral gardenscape out of each forgotten fragment. Through the recollection of stories, language, words, and song, the Ogichidakwe fosters and reasserts the Anishinaabe worldview. This reminds the reader that acts of remembrance can both empower and ensure cultural survival. Although it appears as though this regeneration is accomplished through the efforts of one individual, it is part of an intergenerational chain reaction, where the efforts of community, a collective of elders, conversations with other women and with other memory keepers, all enable the Ogichidakwe to nurture this promising terrestrial space. I envision the Ogichidakwe in Simpson's story as a mirror to Dimaline's elderly healer figure, Minerva, whose role in the novel is that of a medicine woman and memory collector. In Marrow, Thieves, Dimaline imagines a dystopian Canada where languages that were once fluently spoken are reduced to scattered particles of words and images that each migrating character seeks to regain. Dimaline reveals how storytelling, words, dreams, and song assume a spiritual human interconnection. When Frenchie and Clarence first encounter Isaac, the novel's poet and linguist figure, the word Nehioak that Isaac utters falls upon Frenchie's face, wind-like and damp, with breath and mud. Like the fertile garden envisioned in Simpson's for Asinykwe, this Cree utterance, wet and mud-like, promises resolution. This celebration of action and of finding creative spaces of intervention resonates with Mig and Frenchie's momentary contemplation of the changing world. Together, they muse how too much pollution and too much change has led to a world where nature would overwhelm humankind and animals would become predators of humans. They decide accordingly that they must be outside getting ready, suggesting a readiness to relearn languages, and thereby upholding a necessary spirit of impassivity. By carrying forward language, the characters in the Marrow Thieves, all of whom have been uprooted from their nations, maintain a vital sense of cohesion via a common language. For instance, Dimaline describes how in warbling voices, the boys travel in a pack singing a song they made up to an old-timey round dance beat. Their voices are compared to bees settling around a single flower, evoking imagery of community, generativity, and solidarity. Dimaline's narrative posits writing as an empowering process, which speaks to Isaac's vital presence as a linguist and poet figure. In doing so, Dimaline breaks down oppositional thinking that separates orality from literacy. Both means of communicating story contribute to cultural survival. Thus, language recovery, stories, writing, poetry, song, and dreams are articulations of sovereignty that Dimaline's characters are expected to find and then assertively store within the microcosms of their marrow. Furthermore, Dimaline exemplifies how stories can build community. The very proclamation of story time sparks generative moments for her main characters. The word itself puffs over the fire and spreads in a cumulative haze that smells of ground roots and acrid burn. Story is given a meteorological, atmospheric dimension, likened to a massive cloud. When Mig tells stories of Anishinaabe warriors, his audience's response is described in plant-like terms, as though his keen audience is nurtured within the vital ecology that story creates. The women straightened their spines and elongated their necks, their beautiful faces like flowers opening in the heat of a fire. At this moment, story creates a relational space, an energizing communal atmosphere effectuated through the storytelling process. Additionally, story invokes multisensory reactions from Mig's audience. They hunger and thirst for story and smell story, experiencing and remembering it in a whole-bodied way. In the Marrow Thieves, land-based knowledge is integral to Indigenous identity, and Dimaline addresses how violence upon land impacts communities. The scarred, wounded context Dimaline's characters inherit is one that is rife with visceral, violent imagery, and Dimaline seems to blur the distinctions between plants, land, and bodies. Natural landscape is reduced to clear cuts, stripped of topsoil and tilting trees, with rivers cut into pieces. As Frenchie and Rose approach a hidden creek, Dimaline builds up to this cathartic moment by describing the wounds on the surrounding forestry. The trees were dotted with scabs. They sat like blisters on the smooth white of birch. The creek of water that Frenchie discovers is also described fragilely. It tears into frills around rocks, bleeding from somewhere up the hill, carrying itself with quiet grace across the tortured ground, feeding bundles of tenacious roots. This imagery speaks to the wounded, albeit tenacious ecology in which Frenchie is implicated. Although this scene features moments of euphoric catharsis, the insistence on scar-like imagery invokes the legacy of colonial violence upon the landscape. The scars on the land thereby function as apparatuses of remembrance and relationality, emblems that connect the past to the present. Moreover, these configurations of decay, scabbing, and scarring return to the notion of characters treading on a palimpsestic terrain. These wounds may be markers of trauma, yet they can also serve as indicators of survival, and the traces of violence upon the land tell stories of their own. When Frenchie and Mig later identify syllabics etched into the trunk of an elm tree, a moment that precedes their cathartic water discovery moment, at first, the syllabics are interpreted as scars. This is the first time Frenchie has seen written syllabics, yet he immediately associates it with destructive connotations. Realizing what they are, he feels compelled to feel the language on his skin for the first time. Tracing the arrow, line, and dots with their fingers, Frenchie and Mig experience a moment where written language, words, trees, the body, as well as scar-like imagery interconnect to form a whole-bodied, land-based instance of language acquisition. By presenting the tree's bark as a skin-like corporal medium, and by aligning words with the body and with nature, Dimaline may be suggesting that scars, which can either be physical, spiritual, or emotive, may represent stories of loss and disconnection and function as nonverbal signifiers that uphold memories in ways that pen and paper alone cannot. Minerva, whose stature is likened to a tree stump and who wears a flowered handkerchief tied over her head and under her round chin, wields a combination of land-based knowledge as well as dreams, words, memories, and language against the colonial machinery. It is climatically revealed that Minerva, like Simpson's wandering wise woman, had been all along collecting dreams, like bright beads on a string of nights that wound around her each day. Thus, when she sings and when she calls on her blood memory, her teachings, her ancestors, she summons the teachings of the past, ushering echoes of her relatives' rattling bones into the present context and creating an unprocessable force that causes the residential school to collapse into its fallacy of glass and steel. It does not matter that she is only one person, because she is a vessel of resistance, a sage dream carrier akin to Simpson's vision of the Ogichidakwe, who collected memories and wisdom, pulling every dream from her marrow and into her song. Through repetition, Dimaline calls attention to the effects of Minerva's lingual ammunition. There were words in the language that the conductor couldn't process, words the cardinals couldn't bear, words the wires couldn't transfer. As Amon Siem and Eric Risk write, Indigenous stories are resurgent moments which reclaim epistemic ground that was erased by colonialism. The dreams, stories, and words that flow through Minerva generate from reservoirs within her marrow, suggesting that spaces of descent are inherent in the body. As she sings, Minerva draws the listener into a decolonizing space, and in this moment describes the danger of the situation. Despite the dangers of the situation, other Indigenous campers are lured to the site of destruction to witness and be a part of this generative destruction. Under the threatening gaze of the councilman, the campers defiantly made their hands into shallow cups and pulled the air over their heads and faces, making prayers out of ashes and smoke, a gesture which Dimaline succinctly summarizes as real old-timey. When she dies, Minerva's blood blossoms like peonies over craggy asphalt, a final statement where visceral natural imagery connoting life and land is juxtaposed and superimposed over remnants of colonial presence. To conclude, in her essay, Land as Pedagogy, Leanne Simpson hammers the proposition that a resurgence of indigenous political cultures, governances, and nation building requires generations of indigenous peoples to grow up intimately and strongly connected to their homelands. She argues that this requires a radical break from state education systems and a reclamation of land as pedagogy in order to nurture a generation of indigenous peoples that live according to the world views and values of Anishinaabe culture, which is a vision the Marrow Thieves somewhat embodies. During a class on topics in language and literature, I found myself reflecting on the role of state education versus indigenous-centered, community-based experiential learning, which is often either delegitimized or excluded from public and media discourses. What transpired in our class's discussion of education that day was a shared value of alternative systems, and yet a hesitancy towards entirely disposing of state educational systems to learn from the land. I found it challenging to forthrightly state my own position on these difficult questions. Thus, Simpson's essay does raise a relevant talking point for teachers like myself who are encouraged to craft lesson plans that subscribe or adhere to Indigenous principles of learning, as there is a glaring distinction between teaching about indigeneity and altogether indigenizing one's teaching practice. And yet, Dimaline finds promise in the relational potential of stories. Where Simpson envisions land as a form of pedagogy, Dimaline calls attention to the trans-territorial portability and possibilities of stories, how stories can reach into urban spaces and context removed from nature. Comparisons of education systems aside, a novel like The Marrow Thieves centers issues of colonization and its impacts on the environment that can and should be brought into dialogue with current state education classrooms. As Dimaline asserts, not all of us are up to speed on what it means to value the traditional and ecological knowledges that are held by the original inhabitants of the land we call Canada. Yet active listening to and learning from the stories of a people who understood their specific lands intimately is, she argues, a good place to start. With a people whose languages are shaped after the water, hills, and features of their landscapes, a people whose languages have evaded erasure, embedded as they are in the multi-layered records of land.